If you followed recent debates about the British economy, you'll have heard a paradox that keeps cropping up. Britain is both one of the richest countries in Europe and, at the same time, home to some of the poorest regions in Western Europe. It sounds contradictory, but when you look at the data, it's true. The UK has extreme contrasts. London, one of the richest cities in the world, sits alongside parts of the country that rank closer to Eastern European economies when measured by GDP per person. So today, we're going to break this down. We'll look at what the statistics actually say, how the UK compares with other European countries, and why Britain's wealth is so unevenly distributed geographically. And most importantly, we'll explore what this means for the future of the country. This isn't about partisan politics. It's about facts, data, and how they fit together to explain the strange reality of Britain being both the richest and poorest in Europe. Let's start with the basics. By overall economic size, the UK is near the top of the European League table. In 2024, the UK's GDP was roughly £3.1 trillion, making it the second largest economy in Europe after Germany. London alone contributes over a fifth of that figure. The capital is so powerful because it has become a global hub for finance, law, technology, and media, with many major companies choosing to set up their European operations there, bringing high-paying jobs, global investment, and international influence. Measured by total GDP, with London's vast contribution at the centre, Britain ranks as one of the most prosperous countries in Europe. But GDP on its own doesn't tell us much about ordinary people's living standards. To get a clearer picture, economists often use GDP per capita, which divides the country's output by its population. Here, the UK ranks closer to the middle of the Western European pack, behind countries like Ireland, Switzerland, Norway, and Denmark. Still, Britain doesn't look poor. On average, incomes and output are fairly high compared to the global stage. The story changes, though, when we zoom in on regions. The European Union tracks regional wealth using a measure called gross domestic product per head, adjusted for purchasing power. This allows comparisons across different cost of living environments. And the data shows that Inner London is not only the richest region in the UK, it's one of the richest in all of Europe. In fact, Inner London's GDP per capita is more than double the EU average, comparable to Luxembourg or Central Paris. At the same time, several UK regions such as West Wales and the Valleys, Cornwall and parts of Northern Ireland rank at the very bottom of Western Europe. Some of these areas record GDP per capita figures below 75% of the EU average. That puts them on par with much poorer parts of Eastern Europe. It's a striking contrast. The skyscrapers of Canary Wharf and the financial muscle of the City of London coexist in the same country, with regions where economic opportunity is scarce and public services are stretched thin. This dual reality is why commentators often say the UK is both the richest and poorest in Europe. It's not about one statistic. It's about the coexistence of extremes. But why does the UK have such stark regional inequality? Economists point to a few key reasons. The first is geography. The UK's economy has been highly centralised in London and the South East for decades. The capital attracts finance, tech, media and global investment. International companies often set up their European headquarters in London, bringing jobs and high salaries. The South East benefits from proximity to London, strong transport links and a skilled workforce. Meanwhile, regions further from the capital have struggled to keep pace. The decline of heavy industry in the north and parts of Wales left lasting scars. The River Clyde in Glasgow, once called the workshop of the world and responsible for building over a fifth of all of the world's ships, saw its shipyards collapse in the 1970s and 80s. Coal mining in South Wales and the North East, where Britain was once the largest coal exporter in the world with more than 1 million miners employed, was wound down, leaving entire communities without their main source of employment. Steel production in places like Sheffield and Scunthorpe, which had made Britain a global name in steel and produced half the world's steel cutlery at its peak, shrank dramatically. And in Manchester, once known as Cottonopolis for its dominance of global textile production, the mills eventually fell silent. Manufacturing towns that once powered Britain's economy, and in many cases led the world, saw factories close and jobs disappear in the late 20th century. New industries didn't replace them on the same scale. While London reinvented itself as a global finance and services hub, other areas didn't have the same opportunities. The second reason is infrastructure and investment. London has benefited from massive public and private investment, from new underground lines to international airports. By contrast, many regions outside the southeast have seen underinvestment in transport, skills, and economic development. The result is a productivity gap. Workers in London and the southeast produce significantly more output per hour than those in other parts of the UK. The third factor is housing and property wealth. London's property market has exploded in value, creating vast paper wealth for homeowners. In some cases, people have literally become millionaires simply because they purchased a house in the right area several decades ago. A modest terraced home in parts of London bought in the 1970s or 80s for under £50,000 can now be worth well over £1 million. Many people in the southeast have seen their wealth rise dramatically, not through higher wages or business success, but simply through rising house prices. By contrast, property values in former industrial towns remain low. In places like Sunderland, Hull, or the Welsh Valleys, a home might still be worth a fraction of its London equivalent. For many households outside the capital, the family home hasn't been a source of wealth at all, reinforcing the divide between rich and poor regions. All of this combines to create a country where wealth is highly concentrated in certain areas, while others fall behind. How does this compare with other European countries? Regional inequality exists everywhere, but the UK's divide is unusually large. In Germany, for example, there are differences between the wealthy southern states like Bavaria and the poor and eastern regions that used to be part of East Germany. But overall, Germany has invested heavily in balancing regional development since reunification. The gap exists, but it is narrower. In France, Paris dominates the national economy, but regional cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse have more balanced growth. Spain has strong divides between Madrid, Catalonia, and poorer regions like Extremadura. But EU cohesion funds have helped narrow the gap. By contrast, the UK's geographical inequality is among the highest in Western Europe. According to the OECD data, the gap between the richest and poorest regions in the UK is wider than most comparable economies. This isn't just about numbers. It has a real consequence for people's lives. In wealthier regions like London, the average salary is higher, job opportunities are more plentiful, and public services are better funded through local taxes. In poorer regions, wages are lower, opportunities are scarcer, and services are often stretched. Life expectancy also shows the divide. On average, people in affluent parts of London live several years longer than those in some northern towns. Health outcomes, educational attainment, and employment rates all reflect the same pattern. Another consequence is political. The feeling of being left behind has shaped British politics in recent years. The Brexit vote exposed stark divides between London and other regions. Debates about levelling up and regional investment continue to dominate political discourse. Regardless of party, every government has promised to address the regional inequality, yet the gap remains stubbornly wide. So, is it fair to say the UK is the richest and poorest in Europe? From a strictly statistical perspective, the UK contains both extremes. Inner London ranks amongst the richest regions in Europe, while areas like West Wales and Cornwall rank among the poorest in Western Europe. That coexistence is unique in its intensity. Other European countries have rich and poor regions too, but the UK's contrast is particularly stark. What makes the contrast particularly stark is the scale of London's monster economy. London's economy, worth around 500 to 600 billion pounds, $750 billion, is larger than that of entire countries such as Austria, Norway, Denmark, Portugal, and New Zealand. On its own, London would rank among the world's top 25 economies if it were a nation. Yet within the same borders, there are regions struggling with levels of income and productivity comparable to some of the weakest parts of Eastern Europe. Few other countries in Europe display such an extreme internal divide. Make sure you like and subscribe for more breakdowns on the biggest economic stories shaping the UK.